The first time Harriet Ralston heard the name Jacob Fairchild, she was standing in the dry goods store in Redemption, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1884, and the shopkeeper dropped an entire jar of molasses when someone outside fired a gun into the air and shouted that Fairchild was riding in from the south. The jar shattered on the worn pine floorboards, and Mrs. Cora Tibbs, who was 60 years old and had survived Comanche raids and cholera and 2 dead husbands, pressed herself flat against the wall behind the counter, as though she could disappear into the wood itself. The other 2 women in the store grabbed their baskets and their children and pushed through the door in a single panicked rush, and Harriet stood in the middle of it all with her 3-year-old daughter Lily on her hip and her 6-year-old son Will clutching her skirt, watching the molasses spread across the floor in a slow dark lake. "You ought to go," Cora whispered, not moving from the wall. "You got children with you. You especially ought to go." Harriet looked down at Will, who had gone very still and very pale, and she looked at Lily, who did not yet understand fear well enough to feel it, and she turned back to the window and looked out at the main street of Redemption, which had emptied itself in under 2 minutes like water poured out of a boot. She could see him from where she stood. He rode a gray horse, the kind that looked like it had been through hard weather and come out the other side harder for it. The man himself was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had once been black but had faded to the color of an old bruise. He wore no expression that Harriet could identify from this distance, which was perhaps its own kind of expression. He carried no gun drawn. He rode at a walk. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office and sat there a moment, just looking at the closed door, and then he dismounted with the calm, unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere urgent to be and knew it. He was 32 years old if the stories were true. He had been a hired gun in Texas, a scout for the Army during the Apache campaigns, a cattle driver, a man who had worked for ranchers who wanted other men's land and had helped them take it. He had killed men. How many was a number that varied depending on who was telling the story. Some said 8, some said 12, some said more. And the frontier had a way of rounding upward when it came to stories about men like Jacob Fairchild. He was the man the territory used to frighten children. Harriet watched him go into the sheriff's office, and the street stayed empty, and she helped Cora clean up the molasses, and she bought her flour and her salt and her dried beans, and she took her children back to the small ranch 2 miles east of town, where she had been living alone for 8 months since her husband Thomas had died of a fever that had come up fast and mean in the middle of October. She did not think about Jacob Fairchild again for 2 weeks. Then he bought the Callaway spread. The Callaway spread was the ranch directly adjacent to hers, separated from her land by a creek called Hatter's Run that ran clear and cold even in summer, and was full of small silver fish that Will liked to try to catch with his hands. The Callaway place had sat empty for a year since old Gerald Callaway had gone to live with his daughter in Santa Fe, and the house was in rough shape, but the grazing land was good, and Harriet had been hoping. In the quiet, practical way she had learned to hope since Thomas died, that someone decent might buy it and settle there, and perhaps be willing to share equipment and labor during the harder seasons. She found out who had bought it from the land office clerk, a young man named Percy Dunn who had the decency to look apologetic when he told her. "Jacob Fairchild," he said, "paid cash, full price, registered this morning." Harriet stood at the counter for a long moment. "Is there anything preventing it?" she asked. "Legally, I mean." "No, ma'am," Percy said. "A man has the right to purchase land in the territory same as anyone. He's not wanted anywhere currently. I checked." "Currently," Harriet said. "Currently," Percy agreed and looked at his hands. She drove home in her wagon with the afternoon sun pressing hot on her shoulders and the land stretching out around her in every direction, the mesas going purple at their bases, and the sky doing what the New Mexico sky always did in late afternoon, turning colors that seemed too vivid to be real. She thought about Thomas, which she still did every day, not in the raw, tearing way of the first weeks, but in a gentler, sadder way, the way you think about something that has been lost so long it is becoming a story. Thomas had been a good man, a farmer by nature who had come west because the land was cheaper and the possibility was wide, and he had not been built for this country the way some people were built for it, but he had loved it anyway. He had loved Harriet. He had loved Will and Lily, with a completeness that had made her feel safe in a way she had not felt safe since. Now she was 30 years old with 2 children and 160 acres, and a neighbor who was the boogeyman of the New Mexico territory. She did not sleep well that night. In the morning she made a decision, because that was what she did. She was a woman who had decided her way through the last 8 months, decided to stay on the ranch rather than go back to her mother's house in Missouri, decided to hire a hand named Esteban Vega, who was quiet and competent and asked for fair wages, decided to plant her kitchen garden and maintain the cattle herd and repair the east fence herself when it came down in a windstorm in January. She made decisions and then she carried them out, because if she did not, nobody would. The decision she made was this: she would go to the Callaway place and introduce herself, not because she was unafraid. She was afraid. She was very specifically and concretely afraid in the part of her mind that housed the stories: Jacob Fairchild fighting 3 men in a saloon in Las Cruces, Jacob Fairchild burning a line camp in Texas because someone had ordered the men inside it off the land they had settled. But she had children to raise and a ranch to run, and a neighbor was a neighbor. And if the man was going to be there, she thought it was better to know who he was than to be afraid of who she imagined him to be. Will was in school that Thursday morning, the small territorial school in Redemption that ran 3 days a week. Lily was too young for school and too old to be left alone. Harriet put her in the wagon and they drove over the shallow crossing at Hatter's Run and up the long dirt track to the Callaway house. He was on the porch when they arrived. He was not doing anything particularly menacing. He was sitting on the top step with a tin mug of coffee and a piece of saddle leather he was mending, and he looked up when the wagon came along the track with an expression of moderate surprise, as though visitors were not something he had planned for. He was bigger up close than he had seemed from the dry goods store window. He had dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, a jaw that had not met a razor recently, and eyes that were a very clear, very light gray, the same color as his horse, which was a coincidence Harriet noticed and then immediately thought was a strange thing to notice. He stood up. She pulled the wagon to a stop and sat there a moment, Lily pressed against her side, and then she climbed down because she had come here to say something and she was going to say it. "Mr. Fairchild," she said, "I'm Harriet Ralston. My ranch is east of yours across the creek. I wanted to introduce myself." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lily, who was peering over the wagon side board with the frank interest that 3-year-olds give to everything in the world. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. Not rough, exactly, but worn, the way wood gets worn smooth in places where hands have touched it a long time. "I thought it was better to come in person," Harriet said, "than to pretend you aren't there." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not warmth, not exactly, something more like recognition. "Most people do the opposite," he said. "I'm aware of that," she said. "My children need a functioning ranch and so do I, and you're my neighbor, and I've always found it easier to work alongside people I've actually spoken to." "What do you need?" he asked. She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "You said you wanted to work alongside me," he said. "What do you need? I'm asking what you came here to ask." It was direct to the point of being almost rude, but she found she could not honestly call it rude, because it was not unkind, it was simply precise, and she had the sudden sense that this man had no patience for the social rituals that required people to circle around their meaning for 10 minutes before arriving at it. "In the fall," she said, "I'll need help moving cattle to the southern pasture. My hand, Esteban Vega, is good, but he's one man and I'm one woman, and it takes more hands than that to do it cleanly. I'd pay you for your time, or we could work it as a trade for something you need on your end. That's what I came to ask." He looked at her for another long moment. Lily had climbed up onto the wagon seat and was standing on it, holding the back and looking at him over the top of Harriet's head. "Your husband," he said. "Dead last October," she said. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it the way people say things they actually mean, without the softening excess of condolence, just the simple statement of it. "Thank you," she said. He looked at Lily again. Lily, who had no sense of the gravity of this man or this moment, who had no context for legends and fear and cleared streets, waved at him with her small fat hand. He went very still for a moment, the way animals go still when something unexpected happens, and then something in the set of his shoulders changed very slightly, as though something had eased. "I'll help you with the cattle drive," he said. "No payment, you're my neighbor." "I don't need charity," she said. "It's not charity," he said. "It's neighboring, they're different things." She looked at him another moment and then she nodded. "All right," she said. "I'm much obliged." She climbed back up into the wagon and picked up the reins. Lily climbed into her lap, which was her preferred position when in motion. "Mrs. Ralston," he said. She looked back. "I know what people say about me," he said. "I want you to know I won't bring trouble to your land." She looked at him a long moment, and there was something in his face, held very carefully behind the stillness, that she recognized because she had felt it herself. It was the face of a person who has been reduced to a story and is tired of it. "I appreciate you saying so," she said, and drove back across the creek. She did not tell Will and Lily that they had a new neighbor. She mentioned it to Esteban when he came in from mending the north fence for supper, and Esteban went quiet in the way he had, which was not silence but consideration. "I've heard things about him," Esteban said. He was 35, with a wife in the Mexican settlement south of town and 4 children of his own, and a manner that was always careful and never timid. He had come north from Chihuahua 12 years ago and had worked for 3 ranchers in the territory, and he knew the land and the people on it with a thoroughness that came from paying attention. "Most people have," Harriet said. "Some of those things are probably true," Esteban said. "Probably," Harriet agreed. "But some of what people say about men like him is the territory making itself a story to feel bigger than it is. I'd rather see for myself." Esteban nodded once slowly. "I'll keep my eyes open," he said, which was not disagreement, just his way of saying he would remain watchful while she made her choice. That was the beginning. What followed was spring, and then summer, and a neighborliness that grew in the only way things grow well in dry country, slowly and with deep roots. He was not a warm man in the way that Thomas had been warm, open, and easy and quick with a smile. Jacob Fairchild was warm the way the desert is warm, in a way you only noticed when you were close enough and still enough to feel it. He came over the creek twice in May, once to return a mended bridle that had blown from her fence in a windstorm and landed in his yard, and once to tell her that a section of Hatter's Run had been dammed upstream by a beaver, and the water level on her side would drop if it wasn't cleared. Both times he spoke to her directly and plainly and left without lingering. She brought him a pie in early June. She did it because it was the right neighborly thing to do, because his kitchen garden was clearly struggling, and she had started hers early and it was coming in full, and because she had been thinking about what it must be like to have everyone be afraid of you, and she wanted to be the kind of person who did not let other people's fear become her own. She brought Will and Lily with her because she had nobody to leave them with, and because, frankly, she had decided that if Jacob Fairchild was going to be in their lives even peripherally, her children were going to know him as a person rather than a story. She did not tell them who he was in advance, meaning she did not tell them what people said about him. She simply said they were bringing a pie to their neighbor. Will was skeptical. Will had been 6 when Thomas died and was almost 7 now, and he had taken on a gravity that broke Harriet's heart because it was too old for him, the gravity of a small boy who has decided he is the man of the house. He sat in the wagon with his arms crossed and his chin forward and said, "Is this the man everyone is afraid of?" Who said everyone is afraid of him? Harriet said. Tommy Preston said his father said that man is dangerous, Will said. Tommy Preston's father has never met him, Harriet said. We're going to bring him a pie and say hello. You'll make your own judgment. Will considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. All right, he said. Lily was 2 weeks past her 4th birthday now and vibrated with enthusiasm for anything that involved going somewhere. She had the pie on her lap and was regarding it with a possessive interest that suggested Harriet might want to keep an eye on it. Jacob was working in his yard when they arrived, repairing a section of fence along the south side of the house, and he straightened when the wagon came up the track and wiped his hands on his trousers. He looked at the 3 of them in the wagon, and Harriet thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes at the sight of the children, something that was not quite comfortable but was trying to be. Mr. Fairchild, Harriet said, we brought you a pie, apple from my root cellar stores. He stood with his hammer hanging from his hand and looked at the pie, which Lily was now holding up over her head in the manner of an offering. That's kind, he said. Will got down from the wagon with the careful dignity of a small person who is being very grown up, and Harriet climbed down and took Lily in her arms, and they went up to the porch, and Jacob held the door open with a sort of uncertain courtesy, as if he was not entirely sure of the rules for this situation, and was doing his best with them. His house was clean but spare. A table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace that needed repointing, a shelf with a few books that surprised her, a rifle on the wall and a pistol on a hook by the door, a rag rug on the floor that was faded but carefully swept. It smelled of wood smoke and leather and coffee. Lily looked around with enormous eyes and said, "It needs curtains." Jacob looked at her. "Lily," Harriet said. "It does," Lily said serenely, and walked to the middle of the floor and sat down, which was what she did when she was interested in a place. She sat and looked around with complete self-possession. Will stood by the door with his arms still crossed, looking at Jacob with the direct, unsentimental assessment that children deploy when they are deciding about people. Jacob put the pie on the table and turned back to them, and his eyes went to Will, and something about the way the boy was standing seemed to reach him, because he said quietly, "You're the man of the place while your mama works the ranch." Will's chest expanded approximately half an inch. "Yes, sir," he said. "That's real work," Jacob said. "At your age." "I know it," Will said. A silence. Then Will unfolded his arms. Harriet watched the thing that happened next with a kind of wondering attention. Jacob, who had presumably not spent a great deal of time around children, and who she would have guessed would stand in his own house making awkward conversation until she found a graceful exit for them all, looked at the floor where Lily was sitting, and then he sat down on the floor beside her. Not on a chair. On the floor. With his long legs folded under him, his battered hands resting on his knees, sitting at Lily's level as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Lily looked at him with great interest. "That is a very good floor," she informed him. "Thank you," he said with complete seriousness. "The wood is smooth here," she said, running her small hand over it. "And rough here." She moved her hand a few inches. "Why, the smooth part is where people have walked for a long time," he said. "The rough part is where they haven't." Lily considered this. "We should walk on the rough part," she said. "We could do that," he said. Harriet looked at Will. Will was looking at Jacob on the floor with an expression that was moving visibly from wariness to something else. He stood there a moment longer, and then he walked across the room and sat down on the floor on Jacob's other side. Harriet sat in one of the 2 chairs and watched the 3 of them on the floor and felt something shift in her chest, something that was not yet a feeling she could name but was the seed of one. They stayed an hour. Jacob cut the pie and they ate it, sitting on the floor except Harriet, who remained in her chair because she thought someone ought to maintain some dignity and propriety in this situation. Jacob answered Will's questions about the ranch and the horses with patient brevity. He let Lily examine his hands, which she did with scientific thoroughness, turning them over, pressing on his calluses, examining a scar along his left knuckle. He did not flinch or pull away. He said when she asked about the scar that he had cut it on a fence nail a long time ago, which was probably the truth and was certainly a gentler version of any truth she might have received. When they left and drove back over the creek, Will was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He's not what I thought." "No," Harriet said. "He talks to me like I'm a person," Will said. "You are a person," Harriet said. "Some grown men don't do that," Will said, with the precision of a child who has observed the world carefully. Harriet thought about that on the drive home, and she thought about it in the evening when the children were asleep, and she sat on her own porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, and the stars burning overhead in the way they did in New Mexico, close and fierce and too numerous to count. She thought about a man who had been so frightening that people cleared streets at the sound of his name, sitting on the floor of his own house at the level of a 4-year-old girl who wanted to know why the wood was smooth in some places and rough in others. She did not let herself think it meant anything other than that he was more complicated than the stories about him. But she thought about it for a long time. July came in hot and still, and she saw him twice a week, sometimes more. He helped Esteban repair the east fence when a section of it came down in a late spring storm. She sent over cornbread when he was down sick for a week with a summer cold that she knew about because he had not been seen, and she had ridden over to check. And she had stood at his door, and he had answered it looking gray and exhausted, and she had pushed past him and made him soup and left the cornbread, and told him if he did not rest he would get worse. And he had stood in the middle of his kitchen looking at her with an expression she could only describe as stunned. He had come over to thank her 3 days later when he was better, and the conversation had lasted 2 hours. She had not planned for that. She had been shelling beans on the porch and he had sat on the step and they had talked, and when she finally looked at the sun, it was lower than she had thought, and Lily was asleep in her arms, and she could not account for 2 hours that had passed like 20 minutes. He was not an easy talker, but he was an honest one. He said what he meant, and he listened with a completeness that she had rarely encountered, a listening that made her feel that every word she said was being given its proper weight. She told him about Missouri, about her parents, about coming west with Thomas when she was 23, and thinking the whole time that she was afraid of what was out here, and discovering that what was out here was mostly just land and work and the occasional neighbor, same as anywhere. He told her about Texas, not the bad parts, at least not directly. He told her about the land itself, the way the hill country looked in spring with the bluebonnets covering the slopes, the sound of a creek in the limestone country. The way the sky there was different from the sky here, wider, he said, but less dramatic. New Mexico, he said, had the kind of sky that made you feel like something was going to happen. "Is that why you came here?" she asked. He was quiet a moment. "I came here because I need to be somewhere that doesn't know me yet," he said, and then he went quiet again as though he had not meant to say that much. She did not push. She thought about it for days. He came to her with a question in late July. He came in the early evening, and she was at the kitchen table going over her accounts when she heard him at the door, and she noticed that she recognized the sound of his step on the porch, distinct and particular, and that this recognition came with a warmth she was not yet prepared to examine. "I want to ask you something," he said when she opened the door, "and I want you to say no if the answer is no." She stepped back to let him in. "Ask," she said. "Will asked me if he could come see the gray horse," Jacob said. "He asked me himself this morning when I was at the creek. He wants to learn to ride properly, and he said you don't have the time to teach him." Harriet felt a complicated rush of feelings, the first of which was that her son had gone across the creek alone, which they needed to discuss, and the second of which was that her son had gone across the creek because he wanted to see this man, which meant something she had to think about carefully. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him I needed to ask his mother," Jacob said. She looked at him. He was holding his hat in his hands, which she had never seen him do, and he looked careful, she thought. As though this mattered to him and he was being careful not to let that show too much. "You'd teach him to ride," she said. "I'm decent with horses," he said. "And kids should know how to ride out here. It's practical." She thought about Will's face in Jacob's house, sitting on the floor, being talked to like a person. She thought about Will's quiet gravity, the way he had been carrying something since October that was too heavy for a 6-year-old boy. "Saturday mornings," she said. "I'll bring him over, I'll stay." He nodded. "That's fair," he said. "Jacob," she said, and his name came out of her mouth naturally and entirely without her planning it, and they both registered it at the same time, a small thing with a weight to it. "Thank you for asking me first." He was quiet a moment. "I should always ask you first," he said. "He's yours." She did not know what to do with that, so she said, "I'll send a pie when I do the baking this week." And he put his hat back on and left, and she went back to her accounts and sat there for a very long time not looking at the numbers. Saturday mornings became the best part of the week. She would not have predicted that. She would have thought they would be useful mornings, a child learning a practical skill from a competent neighbor. She would not have predicted the specific quality of the light on the Calloway place in the early morning, the way the air smelled of horse and dry grass, and something that she eventually identified as the cedar wood Jacob burned, or the way Will changed on those mornings, becoming looser and younger, laughing in a way she had not heard since before Thomas died. Jacob taught him to ride with the same directness he brought to everything, no excess words, no false encouragement, just clear, patient instruction, and a willingness to repeat himself without impatience. The gray horse, whose name was Dust, was steady and broad-backed and bore Will's enthusiastic inexperience with philosophical calm. Harriet sat on the fence and watched, and sometimes Lily sat beside her, and sometimes Lily got down and went to stand next to Jacob, who had made his peace with Lily's presence the way you make peace with the weather, by accepting that it was not going to change and might as well be appreciated. One Saturday in August, while Will was putting Dust through his paces in the yard, and Lily was very earnestly explaining something to Jacob about the habits of a particular bug she had found, Harriet sat on the fence and watched them and thought, with a clarity that arrived without warning, "I am in danger of loving this man." She did not panic. She was 30 years old and she had survived loss, and she knew that the feelings you were in danger of had a better claim on you than the feelings you chose. She sat on the fence in the August morning, and she let the thought be true, and she thought about what it meant. It meant she was going to have to be careful. It meant she was going to have to know more about who he actually was before she let this go any further. It meant she needed to understand, not from rumor but from the man himself, what had happened in Texas and elsewhere, because she had children, and her children had already lost one person they loved, and she could not let anything else happen to them. She waited until September, when the cooling evenings made sitting on her porch comfortable again, and she invited him for supper after a long day when they had ridden the fence line together looking for places that needed mending before winter. They had been doing things like that for 2 months now, the easy practical exchange of labor that she had imagined when she first went to his door. He helped with things on her place, and she helped with things on his, and they kept rough accounts in their heads that never quite came out even, but that they both understood was not entirely the point. After supper, when Will and Lily were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch with coffee, and Harriet said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask," he said, because that was what he always said and she had come to appreciate it. "I need to know what is true," she said. "About Texas, about the things people say." He was quiet for a long moment. The night was full of crickets and the occasional lonely sound of a coyote somewhere far off, and the air smelled of cooling earth. "Some of it is true," he said. "Tell me," she said. Not a demand, a request with weight behind it, he told her. He had worked for a cattle baron named Harvest Colton in West Texas from the time he was 20 until he was 28. He had not been hired as a killer. He had been hired as a ranch hand, and then as a scout, and then as a man who handled problems. Some of those problems were rustlers, legitimate threats, men who preyed on the cattle and the people who tended them. He handled those problems and he was good at it, and Colton paid him well, and he had believed for a while that he was doing a version of justice. But Colton had wanted more land, and the people on the land Colton wanted were not rustlers. They were families, homesteaders, small acreage ranchers like Harriet herself, and Colton's methods of convincing them to leave were not gentle. And Jacob had been part of those methods, at first only on the edges and then more deeply. And there had been a point where he had understood clearly what he was doing, and had kept doing it anyway because he was good at it and well paid, and because the habit of it had made him what he was, and he had not yet found a way out. He had left when Colton's men burned a house. Nobody had died in the fire. The family had gotten out. But the house had been their life, their years, their children's only shelter, and they had stood in the yard watching it burn, and Jacob had sat on his horse and watched them watch it burn, and something in him had become very certain and very cold, and he had ridden away from Colton's employ that night, and he had not gone back. He was 28. He had spent the next 4 years drifting, doing work where he could get it, some of it decent, some of it not, trying to put distance between himself and what he had been, and finding that distance was not something you could measure in miles. "I came here," he said, "because I wanted somewhere I could be something different. I knew my name was known. I didn't know it was that widely known." A pause. "I should have, I suppose." The porch was quiet. "Did you ever hurt anyone who didn't deserve hurting?" Harriet said. "Be honest." A long silence. "I scared people," he said. "I was the man riding toward them when they didn't know what was going to happen. Even if I didn't touch one of them, I was part of it. That's a kind of hurt." She thought about that. "The house that burned," she said. "You didn't set that fire." "I was there," he said. "I didn't stop it." She was quiet for a long time. She was thinking about the man on the floor with Lily, examining the smooth and rough places in the wood. She was thinking about Will on Dust's back, laughing. She was thinking about how Thomas had been a good man from the beginning, and how good men, in her experience, were not always the same thing as honest men, and Jacob Fairchild was the most honest man she had ever sat on a porch with. "I think," she said carefully, "that a person can be more than the worst thing they have done." He looked at her. "I think that is something a person has to earn," he said, "not something they get to just decide." "I agree," she said. "That's why I asked." He looked out at the dark yard. "Are you afraid of me?" He said, and the way he asked it was very quiet and had a kind of vulnerability in it that she suspected very few people had ever seen. "No," she said, and meant it completely. He turned to look at her. "I was," she said, "the first day, but not now." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark, the lamp from inside the window throwing a thin, warm light across the porch, and she could see his face and the thing in it that she had been looking at since June without naming. She named it now in her own mind quietly, longing, the kind of longing that has been patient for a very long time. "Harriet," he said. She looked at him. "I think you ought to know," he said, "that I'm not a man who talks about feelings easily. I don't have the language for it. I never learned it." "I know," she said, "but there is something," he said. Here he stopped. "I know," she said again, more softly. He looked at his hands, then he looked at her. "What do I do with that?" he said, and the question was so naked and undefended that she felt it like a hand on her heart. "You don't have to do anything with it right now," she said. "We're neighbors, we're friends, I think. You're teaching my son to ride. These are good things, let them be good." He breathed out. "Yes," he said, "all right." They sat in the quiet for a while longer, and then he said good night and walked back across the dark to the creek. And she listened to the sound of hatters run in the night, and thought about the particular courage it took to be honest about the worst of yourself and still believe you might be worth something. October came, and the cattle drive happened as planned. Jacob and Esteban and Harriet, and a man named Crow Feathers who worked for the rancher to the north, and had agreed to help for 2 days, moved the cattle to the southern pasture in 3 days of hard riding that left Harriet sore to her bones, but satisfied in the deep animal way of work well done. Lily stayed with Esteban's wife, Rosa, in the Mexican settlement, and Will came along riding Dust because Jacob had judged him ready, and he did the job of a real rider, staying with the herd, reading the cattle, doing what he was told without complaint. At the end of the third day, around the fire, with the cattle settled and the night sky above them so thick with stars it seemed to press down, Jacob said to Will without ceremony, "You ride like you were born doing it." Will looked at the fire. He was very careful not to let anyone see how much this meant to him, because he was 7 now and he had dignity. But Harriet saw his face for just a second, and the thing on it was so pure that she had to look away before she embarrassed them both by crying. The night of the cattle drive's end, they camped in the southern pasture, and Crow Feathers, who was a man of few words but an excellent harmonica player, played for a while before the fire while the stars moved overhead. Jacob sat next to Harriet and Will slept between them wrapped in a blanket, and they sat close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and neither of them moved away. "This is a good place," Jacob said quietly, meaning her land, meaning the territory, meaning something larger than both. "It is," she said. He turned to look at her in the firelight, and the thing between them was very clear and very present, and they both knew it and had both been careful with it for months, and she thought, "This is the right moment, if there is going to be one." She put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. His hand turned under hers very gently, and his fingers came up between hers and held them, and they sat like that for the rest of the fire, her son sleeping between them, the cattle breathing in the dark, Crow Feathers playing something slow and sweet on the harmonica. She thought, whatever else there is to figure out, whatever comes next, this is already something worth having. November arrived with the first serious cold, and they moved between each other's houses with the ease of people who have stopped needing a reason. He was there for Thanksgiving, which she cooked, and he ate with the focused appreciation of a man who had eaten too many meals from a tin over a fire. He brought her a cord of wood he had cut when he saw her supply was getting low, and he left it stacked against her house before she knew he was doing it, and she found it one morning and stood next to it in the cold, and felt the kind of gratitude that goes all the way down. She kissed him in December. It was not planned. It was the afternoon before Christmas Eve, and she had come over with gingerbread cookies because Will had decided that it was important for Jacob to have gingerbread, and had lobbied for it with impressive persistence. And she had brought Will and Lily, and they had spent an afternoon making their version of Christmas in his spare house. And it had been warm and improbable and full of Lily's narration of every action she took as she took it. Will had fallen asleep on the rag rug. Lily was asleep in the one bedroom, having commandeered the bed with the confidence of a child who has never doubted her welcome. The house was quiet and warm and smelled of gingerbread and wood smoke. Jacob was washing the tin plates and she was drying them, standing at his kitchen table, and she turned to put the last plate on the shelf and turned back and found him closer than she had expected, both of them reaching for the same shelf at the same time, and they stopped. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with something in his face that was completely unguarded, something she had been watching work its way to the surface for 6 months, and she thought, if not now, when? She put her hand on his jaw, which was rough with several days of stubble and warm under her palm, and she kissed him. He went very still for one breath, and then he kissed her back, careful and thorough and entirely present, one hand coming up to rest at her waist, not pulling her closer, just resting there as if to say, "I am here, I am staying." It was a long kiss. When they parted, she kept her hand on his face and he kept his at her waist, and they looked at each other in the warm kitchen. "Well," he said after a moment. "Well," she agreed. "I'm glad you came over," he said. She laughed quietly so as not to wake the children. "The gingerbread was Will's idea." "I know," he said. "I was still glad." She let her hand drop from his face, and he let his drop from her waist, and they stood there in the kitchen, both of them smiling, and it was one of the best moments of her life. They were careful through January and February, which were the hardest months, cold and confining. The ranch work relentless in the way it was relentless in winter. The mending and the feeding and the keeping of pipes from freezing and the keeping of animals alive. Jacob came to her house for supper 3 times a week, and she went to his twice, and there was nothing secret about it in the sense that Esteban knew and Rosa knew, and the people in Redemption knew, though what they thought of it was not something Harriet went to town often enough to collect. She heard from Cora Tibbs, who had recovered from her fear of Jacob Fairchild with the resilience of a woman who has survived 2 husbands and a great deal else, that the general feeling in town was mixed. Some people thought Harriet was being reckless. Some people said she was a grown woman and her business was her own. The sheriff, a steady man named Orrin Beaumont who had been in the territory 15 years and had survived multiple elections on the strength of being neither corrupt nor excitable, had spoken to Jacob in the fall and formed the opinion, which he shared with anyone who asked, that the man was apparently trying to be something other than what he had been, and that was as much as any man could do, and he would treat him accordingly. Harriet appreciated Orrin Beaumont. There were people who did not share his view. In February, a man rode into Redemption who had known Jacob in Texas. His name was Mitch Holt, and he was large and slow-looking in the way that some dangerous men are, and he had the face of someone who had been carrying a grievance for a long time and had arrived at his destination. He told people in the saloon that Jacob Fairchild was a hired killer and a coward, and he had business with him. Harriet heard about this from Percy Dunn on a Friday morning when she came to town for supplies, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach. She went to the sheriff. "I know about Holt," Orrin Beaumont said, before she could speak. He was behind his desk with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had been thinking about a problem for 12 hours. "I've spoken to him. He has no outstanding warrants. I can't arrest him for being angry. He's here to provoke Jacob," she said. "That's my assessment, yes," Orrin said. "I've told him that any trouble in this county will be met accordingly. I can't guarantee a result I don't have the authority to produce." She went to Jacob. She drove out to his place that afternoon and she found him in the yard with dust, and when she told him, he went very still, the kind of stillness she recognized now, not peace but control. "Mitch Holt," he said. "You know him." "I know him," he said. "He worked for Colton. He was there the night the house burned." She looked at him. "He said it," Jacob said. "Not me." "Him, and I know he knows it. He wants to fight you," she said. "He wants to make me the story," Jacob said. "He wants to be in a town and have witnesses when he provokes me, because then whatever happens, the man who used to be Jacob Fairchild hired gun, that's the story. Doesn't matter what came before it." "What are you going to do?" she said. He looked at her. "Nothing," he said. "I'm going to do nothing. I'm going to stay here and do my work and not go into town until he leaves." She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "That's not a coward's choice," she said. "I know it," he said. "It's the only choice that leads somewhere worth going." She crossed the yard and took his face in her hands the way she had in December and looked at him. "I need you to be all right," she said. "I need that." His hands came up to cover hers. "I will be," he said. Mitch Holt stayed in Redemption for 4 days. On the 3rd day he rode out to the Calloway place and found Jacob in his yard and said things that Harriet, who was not there, heard about later from 3 different people who agreed on the substance if not the exact words. And Jacob stood in his yard and did not draw and did not swing and said, clearly and in earshot of the 2 men who had ridden out with Holt as witnesses, that he had no quarrel with Holt and was not interested in acquiring one, and asked him to leave his property. Holt left. On the 4th day he rode out of Redemption. The story went around the territory, which was how stories did in 1884 and 1885, traveling by letter and by the mouths of traveling men, and by the telegraph where the lines ran. People told it differently, and they still did, some of them, call Jacob Fairchild's name to frighten children. But in Redemption, the story that people told was different. The story that people told in Redemption was about a man who had done hard and regrettable things, and who had come to a place and stayed quiet and worked his land, and sent a hired gun away by refusing to be what the hired gun needed him to be. It was not a simple story. Real ones rarely are. Spring came again. A full year since Harriet had first driven to his door with Lily in her arms, and a directness that she had inherited from her mother, and had never once regretted. The apple trees along the south side of her house, which Thomas had planted the first year and which had taken several years to come into proper production, bloomed white and dense and sweet in April, and she and Jacob stood among them one evening, and the light came through the branches, and she thought, "This is the kind of thing a person only gets once or twice in a life, if they're lucky, and you have to recognize it when it comes." "I want to ask you something," Jacob said, which was what she had said to him on the September porch, and she recognized the echo of it. "Ask," she said. He was quiet a moment. He was not a man who spoke from impulse. Everything he said had been considered, had been weighed, which meant it was always true but sometimes slow. "I want to stay here," he said. "Not just next door here. I want to be part of this. Your children, your place, you." He stopped. "I know what I am. I know what's in my history. I don't know if that's something you can ask your children to." "Jacob," she said. He stopped. "Will worships you," she said. "Lily has decided you belong to her as completely as the floor and the horses do. And she paused because she was not a woman who said things like this easily, and she wanted to be precise. "I have loved you since the moment you sat down on the floor." He looked at her. "You sat down on the floor with my daughter," she said, "when you didn't have to, when it wasn't comfortable, when nobody would have thought less of you for sitting in a chair like a grown man. And I knew then. It just took me some time to know that I knew it." He was quiet for a long moment with the apple blossoms coming down around them in the small evening wind. "I would like to marry you," he said. "If you'll have me." "Yes," she said without hesitation, because she had been working her way toward yes since September, and she had arrived at it a long time ago. He kissed her there among the apple trees, a long and unhurried kiss that tasted of the evening and the coffee they'd had at supper and the sweetness of the blossoms coming down, and she felt, deep in her chest, the particular settling of a thing that has found its right place. They told the children the following morning. Will took it in the deliberate way he took everything, sitting at the breakfast table with his hands around his mug of warm milk, listening while Harriet explained what marrying meant in practical terms, that Jacob would live here with them, that his place and hers would be worked together, that he would be part of the family. Like a father, Will said, and looked at Jacob, who was sitting across from him with the careful attention of a man for whom this moment matters more than most things. "Not like your father," Jacob said. "Your father was your father, and he was a good man from what I've heard. I won't try to be that, but I will be here, every day, for whatever you need." Will looked at him for a very long time. Then he said, "That's good enough," with the gravity that was so distinctly his, and went back to his milk. Lily had been listening with enormous eyes and had arrived at her own conclusion approximately 30 seconds into the explanation. "We have to fix the curtains," she said. "I'm sorry," Jacob said. "In your house," Lily said. "I said it needed curtains. Now we can fix them." Jacob looked at Harriet. She pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. "I suppose we can do that," he said. "I know what color," Lily said, and launched into a detailed description that lasted the rest of breakfast. They married in June, 1 year and 2 months after Harriet had driven over the creek with a pie, and a resolve to see her neighbor clearly rather than through the lens of his reputation. The ceremony was in Redemption at the small church that served the community, performed by a minister named Reverend Adkins, who had been in the territory for 6 years, and had married and buried his share of the frontier's people, and knew how to say the words with the weight they deserved. Cora Tibbs came, having completed her evolution from the woman who hid behind her counter to one of Harriet's staunchest defenders. Orrin Beaumont came. Esteban and Rosa came with their 4 children, and Rosa cried in the generous way of someone who has been hoping for this particular ending since November. Percy Dunn came and looked appropriately moved. Will stood very straight next to Jacob during the ceremony, in the position of a boy who understands the significance of where he is standing and has decided to honor it fully. Lily had her hair in ribbons and had located and donned every piece of Sunday dress she owned, and sat between Rosa and Cora, and ate the ceremonial biscuits that were passed around afterward, with a contentment that suggested the universe had arranged itself correctly. Jacob wore a clean coat and a fresh-pressed shirt that Harriet had pressed herself, and his boots were polished to a shine that took effort and showed it. And when Reverend Adkins asked him if he would love and cherish and keep this woman, his voice, when he said yes, was as clear and certain as she had ever heard it. She said yes back, and she meant it with everything she had. They went home across the creek in the late afternoon, the children already drowsing against each other in the wagon, and the territory spread around them in every direction, the mesas turning their evening colors, the sky doing its improbable best, and Harriet sat close to Jacob on the wagon seat with his arm around her, watching the land she had kept through one hard year, and was now sharing with a man who had come to it in search of something worth becoming. The first summer of their marriage was busy and good. They combined the operation of the two ranches into one, the Callaway place becoming extension of the Ralston land, which they registered jointly under both names. Jacob had knowledge of cattle that Harriet had not had access to, and she had knowledge of crops and preservation, and the particular domestic architecture of making a place survive that he was learning. And together with Esteban, they made the combined ranch run better than either had run separately. Jacob built a room onto the house that fall, working with Esteban on weekends and evenings, a proper bedroom for Will that had a window facing east, because Will had said once in passing that he liked to see the sun come up, and Jacob had remembered it and built the window accordingly. And when Will saw it the morning after it was finished, he stood at the window and looked at the eastern light and did not say anything for a long time, and then he turned around and the gravity on his face, the too-old heaviness he had been carrying since October 2 years ago, had lifted slightly, and Harriet saw it from the doorway and had to press her hand over her mouth. She was pregnant by October. She told Jacob on a Tuesday evening after supper when the children were in bed, and he went very still in the way he did, but this stillness was different from all the other kinds. It was full rather than controlled. It was the stillness of something large and good settling into a person. "Are you well?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Very well." He crossed the room and put both arms around her and held on, not dramatically, just thoroughly, and she put her face against his neck and felt his heartbeat, steady and quick. "I don't know how to do this," he said very quietly. I don't know the shape of it." "You sat on the floor," she said, against his neck. He was quiet a moment. "You do know how," she said. "You knew before I did." He held on a little tighter. "I will try every day," he said. "That is all I need," she said. Will took the news of a new baby with philosophical acceptance. He asked several practical questions about where the baby would sleep and whether it would cry at night, both legitimate concerns that Harriet answered honestly. Lily responded by immediately selecting the name, which she announced was Daisy if a girl and Albert if a boy, and no other options were being considered. "What if we want to choose?" Jacob said. "I have already chosen," Lily said, with the serenity of a child who has never yet been seriously thwarted and sees no reason to start preparing for it. Jacob looked at Harriet. "She is your daughter," he said, in a tone that was half amazed and half defeated and entirely fond. "She has always been her own person," Harriet said. The baby was born in June, a full year after their wedding, on a Tuesday morning when the air was warm and soft, and the apple trees were in their second bloom since she had kissed Jacob among them. It was a boy. He was pink and furious and loud from the first breath, entirely himself, and Rosa, who had come to help with the delivery, declared him a fine specimen and handed him to Harriet, who held him and looked at his face and felt the specific ancient wonder of a new person who had not been there yesterday. Jacob came in when it was done and sat on the edge of the bed, and Harriet put the baby in his arms and watched his face. He looked at the baby for a long time. He looked at him with the gray eyes that had frightened people, with the face that had cleared streets, and what was on it now was an expression so unguarded and so full that Harriet thought of all the stories, all the rumor and legend and fear, and thought how little it caught of the actual person, how vastly it missed the man who was sitting on the edge of her bed holding a new son and looking like the best version of himself. "Albert is a fine name," Jacob said. Lily, who had materialized in the doorway in her nightgown, said, "I know," with satisfaction. Will came in behind her and stood at Jacob's shoulder and looked at the baby with a mixture of wonder and the specific skepticism of an 8-year-old boy regarding something so small and loud. "He's very red," Will said. "He'll improve," Jacob said. "Can I hold him?" "Carefully," Harriet said, and helped Will sit on the bed and settled the baby in his arms and watched Will's face go through 17 different expressions in 5 seconds as the weight and realness of his brother landed on him. Albert opened his eyes. "He's looking at me," Will said, barely breathing. "He is," Harriet said. "Does he know who I am?" "He'll learn," Jacob said. "You've got years to show him." Will looked up at Jacob, and the thing between them, the thing that had been building since the first Saturday on Dust's broad back, was completely present and open, and Will said, in a voice that was trying to be casual and was not quite succeeding, "You'll be here for those years." Jacob held his gaze. "Every one of them," he said. "Every single one." The following years in redemption were good ones, in the way that good years are good, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary sorrows that come to any family and any frontier, but full and grounded and real. The ranch expanded. Esteban's wages went up and he and Rosa built a proper house on the south pasture. Will grew tall and capable, and at 12 was riding as well as any man in the territory and had his father's. He said father's, deliberately, Jacob's eye for cattle. Lily grew in the direction of her own particular nature, which was one of unstoppable curiosity and great certainty about how things should be arranged. She redesigned the kitchen garden 3 times and kept records of everything in a notebook she had been given for Christmas. She announced at age 7 that she intended to be a doctor, which in 1891 was a statement requiring extraordinary confidence in a girl in the New Mexico territory, and neither Harriet nor Jacob told her it was impossible. Jacob found and ordered her a basic medical text and sat with her at the table while she read it and asked him questions, and he answered what he could and said he didn't know when he didn't know, and helped her write a letter to the woman doctor in Santa Fe who had been practicing medicine for 6 years, who wrote back a generous 3-page letter that Lily read until it fell apart at the folds. Albert grew to be a solid, cheerful boy with Jacob's gray eyes and Harriet's determination, and a talent for mischief that his siblings regarded with a mixture of exasperation and admiration. He was never in serious trouble. He was merely frequently in minor trouble of the creative kind, and Jacob handled it with a directness and consistency that produced, over time, a boy who knew exactly where the lines were and why they were there. There were bad days, too. There was a year when the cattle were struck by disease and they lost 1/3 of the herd, and the money was very tight through the winter, and Jacob took day work at a neighboring ranch without complaint, and Harriet stretched every provision further than she would have thought possible. There was the winter when Will was 10 and got a lung sickness that lasted 6 weeks and left them all exhausted with worry, and Jacob sat by the boy's bed for 3 nights running, and Harriet brought him coffee and they took turns, and when the fever finally broke, Jacob's relief was so physical and so total that he put his face in his hands, and Harriet put her arms around him from behind and held him until he came back to himself. There was the thing that happened with the land. 2 years into their marriage, a man named Stanton arrived in Redemption, representing an Eastern land company that was buying up acreage throughout the territory. He came to see Harriet and Jacob with a very polite offer for their land, and when they declined, he came back with a less polite offer, and when they declined that he began having conversations with other people in the county about water rights and property lines that were intended to create uncertainty about the legitimacy of their title. Jacob went to see him. Harriet did not know what was said. She had asked Jacob to handle it without violence, and he had said he would, and she had to trust that, and she did, and she trusted it completely. He went into town, and he spoke to Stanton in the hotel dining room for 30 minutes, and Stanton left Redemption on the morning stage the next day, and his land company's inquiries in that county stopped. She asked Jacob what he had said. I told him the exact legal history of every parcel of land in this county that his company had acquired under questionable circumstances, Jacob said. And I told him I had written that history down and given a copy to Orrin Beaumont and to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. She looked at him. I spent a week in the county records before I went to see him, Jacob said. He's doing in this territory what Colton did in Texas. I know the shape of it. I knew what to look for, and I found it. She took his face in her hands, the gesture that was theirs now worn smooth with use the way wood is worn smooth where hands have touched it for years. You are not what you were, she said. I used what I was to do something different with it, he said. That's the best I can do. It is enough, she said. It is more than enough. She kissed him and he kissed her back, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay warm on the floor, smooth and rough in turns, the way floors get when people have lived on them for a long time. Orrin Beaumont retired from the sheriff's office in 1892, and the county voted, with an impressiveness that Harriet found moving, for a man named David Torres who had grown up in the Mexican settlement south of town and had studied law in Santa Fe and had come back to practice it here. Jacob voted for him. Will, who was 15 by then and burning with opinions about justice and fairness that his mother recognized as her own poured through Jacob's lens, made an impassioned case for Torres to every adult in the county who would stand still long enough to hear it. Torres won by a comfortable margin, and the county was better for it. The spring of 1893, when Albert was 4 and Will was 16 and Lily was 13, and the apple trees had been in production for a decade, and the ranch was solid and paid its expenses and turned a modest profit, Harriet sat on the porch on an April evening and looked at the last of the light going off the mesas and thought about the day she had first driven over the creek. She had been afraid. She had been practical about her fear. She had chosen not to let it make decisions for her, and in that choice, made on a cold, practical morning with a pie on the seat beside her and 2 children in the wagon, she had found everything that had come after. Jacob came out and sat beside her. He had Albert on his back, the boy riding him piggyback with his arms around Jacob's neck and his chin on the top of Jacob's head, which was where Albert liked to be at the end of the day. Jacob sat on the step and Albert transferred to his lap and leaned back against his chest and looked at the mesas with his father's gray eyes. Red, Albert said, which was what he said about sunsets and had been saying since he first developed a vocabulary. Red, Jacob agreed. Will came out with a book under his arm and sat on the railing in the way she had asked him not to 100 times and would apparently ask him not to forever. Will, she said. I know, he said, and did not move. Lily appeared in the doorway behind them with her notebook and a pencil and said, I've been thinking about medical school. This was not new. Lily had been thinking about medical school since she was 7. The thinking had become more specific over the years and now included actual institutions, their locations, their admission requirements, and their policies regarding women students, which she had researched with a thoroughness that would have impressed any librarian. Tell me, Harriet said, because that was what she always said to Lily. Lily described a school in the East that had begun admitting women to full medical programs the previous year, and she described the entrance requirements, and she described the letter she wanted to write to them requesting application materials, and she described what she expected the challenges to be and how she planned to address them. Jacob listened with his complete attention, the way he gave everything his complete attention. You'll write the letter, he said when she was done. I intend to, Lily said. I'll help you with it if you want, he said. Lily considered this. I'll write it first, she said, then you can look at it. Fair, he said. She went back inside to write the letter. The evening settled and Albert fell asleep in Jacob's lap, and will read his book on the railing that he was not supposed to sit on. And Harriet looked at the mesas going dark and felt the deep-rootedness of a life that has taken hold in good soil. The kind that goes down far enough to survive the hard years. The kind that has been tended by two people who chose it together and kept choosing it. She thought about what Jacob had said the night she had asked him about Texas. He came here because he needed somewhere that didn't know him yet. She thought about what he had become here, in the specific gravity of this land and these people and this family, and she thought the thing she had been thinking since December in the year they met. A person can be more than the worst thing they have done. It was not a simple story, but it was a true one, and it was theirs. The summer passed into fall with the ease of years that are good to the people living them. Will turned 17 in the autumn and was already talking about what came next, whether he would stay on the ranch or go to school or perhaps both, in sequence. And Jacob told him there was no reason why a man couldn't work his land and educate his mind, and there were ways to do both if he was willing to plan it. They talked about it at the supper table, the long, easy conversations that Harriet loved most about their family, where ideas got turned over and everyone's opinion was taken seriously regardless of their age. Albert began school that fall, at the same small territorial school that Will had attended, now expanded to 5 days a week and run by a teacher named Miss Eliza Marsh, who had come west from Ohio with a determination to educate the frontier's children that was formidable in its own quiet way. Albert liked school in the particular way of a child who likes learning, but has reservations about sitting still, which meant he came home with excellent marks and frequent notes about his tendency to reorganize his classmates' activities during recess. In November, Lily received an answer from the medical school. It was a letter of genuine encouragement, not the polite discouragement Harriet had half expected, but a genuine letter from the admissions office saying that while the process was competitive, her description of her preparation and her evident seriousness made her a worthwhile candidate. There were requirements to meet, examinations to take, letters of recommendation to gather. Lily read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table, and then put it down very carefully and sat with her hands flat on the table. And Harriet watched her daughter's face do something it had never quite done before, which was allow itself to believe. Jacob was in the yard and Lily went out to him without a word and handed him the letter. He read it standing in the yard with the November air cold around them, and then he looked at his daughter, because she was his daughter. She had been his since the day she sat on his floor and told him the wood was rough in the places people hadn't walked, and he said, "I always knew." Lily, who was not a crier, came very close to crying, and then did not, which was very her. "I'll need the examinations," she said, practical to the last. "We'll get them," he said, "whatever you need." He caught Harriet's eye over Lily's head, and what passed between them in that look was too large for words but had a clarity to it that she understood completely. It was the look that said, this is what it was for, all of it. The hard year, the cattle drives, the nights sitting with Will through his sickness, the work and the cost and the choosing. It was for this moment, this girl standing in the yard with a letter that said her life could be as large as she had always known it was. The winter of 1893 was mild, which was a gift. Christmas that year was the kind of Christmas that happens when a family has found its shape and settled into it, comfortable and full of its own particular rituals. Jacob cut a cedar tree from the south slope, which he did every year, and they decorated it with the ornaments Harriet had brought from Missouri, glass balls that had survived a decade of frontier Christmases through improbable good fortune, and strings of dried cranberries that Albert threaded with extreme earnestness and some degree of personal consumption. After the children were in bed, Harriet and Jacob sat by the fire and she leaned into his side and he had his arm around her, and the cedar smelled of every other Christmas they had made together, and she said, "Are you happy?" He was quiet a moment in his way, but this quiet was immediate in content. "I did not think," he said, when I rode into this territory that this was where I was going to end up. Where did you think you were going to end up? She said. Nowhere in particular, he said. I didn't think past the next season. She thought about that. I think about it sometimes, he said. That morning you drove over the creek, you could have sent a letter, most people would have. I never saw the point of a letter when you could go yourself, she said. I know, he said. I know that about you. She tilted her head back to look at him. The firelight was on his face and the gray in his hair had spread further now, and she loved it. The way you love the particular face of a person you have looked at so many times that it is part of your own understanding of the world. I'm very happy, he said, and his voice had the quality that told her he meant it from somewhere deep and certain. She put her hand against his chest. Good, she said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and they stayed that way a long time, while the fire went down to coals, and the cedar smell filled the room, and the children slept through the long winter quiet, and the territory lay outside the window in the dark, enormous and indifferent and full of possibilities for the people who were willing to see each other truly. Spring came again as it always did, not asking for permission, not requiring anything from the people it found, just arriving with its particular insistence that things would grow. The apple trees bloomed again, white and then gone, and Harriet walked among them as she had walked among them the year Jacob asked her to marry him, and she thought about a frontier that was already changing. The territory was closer to statehood every year, and the open land was filling in with more people and more roads, and the telegraph lines were going further and the world was compressing, and the particular wild solitude of 1884 was becoming something else. But the creek still ran cold at Hatter's Run, and Dust was older and quieter, and let Albert ride him now on the broad-backed patient schedule of an old horse who has made his peace with children. Esteban's oldest son worked the ranch alongside his father now. Will had decided he would study for a year in Santa Fe in the fall and come back to run the expanded ranch with Jacob, a plan that made Jacob's face do the thing it did when something moved him, go very still and then open, like a door. Lily had her examinations arranged for the following September. Albert had started a nature journal modeled on the one Lily kept, except his was populated largely by drawings of insects and small reptiles of his own invention, combined with observations of actual ones, which made it both scientifically interesting and creatively ambitious. One evening in April, Harriet found Jacob at the creek. He was sitting on the bank of Hatter's Run with his boots off and his feet in the cold water, looking across to the Callaway land, which was their land now, which had been their land for years. He heard her coming and made room on the bank, and she sat beside him and pulled off her own boots because why not, and put her feet in the water, which was cold enough to make her gasp. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He was quiet a moment. "Gerald Callaway's spread," he said, "the first day I saw it. I thought I was buying a place to disappear into." She looked at the water. "Then your wagon came up the track," he said, "and you got down and said your piece, and I thought, this woman is the most direct person I have ever met." She laughed. "I thought I should be honest with you right off," she said, "because if I wasn't, I'd spend the rest of my time here either afraid of you or pretending I wasn't, and I've never been good at pretending." "No," he agreed. "You have never been good at pretending." The creek ran over the rocks and the evening birds began their particular announcements, and behind them from the house, they could hear Albert's voice explaining something to someone with great energy, which was more or less the constant condition of Albert. Jacob looked at the water. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "Every morning when I wake up in this house," he said, I didn't think I'd get here, and every morning I'm surprised that I did." He paused. "And then I get up and it is just the day, and the day is full of everything. The children, the land, you." He stopped. "I've been trying to find the right word for what that is for a long time, and I don't think there is one. It's just that it's everything I didn't expect, and it turned out to be everything." She looked at him. He turned to look at her. She leaned forward and kissed him. They're on the bank of Hatter's Run with their feet in the cold water and the territory going to gold around them, and he kissed her back with the same thoroughness and presence she had found in him in that first December kitchen, unchanged after all these years, and the water ran over the rocks and the evening went on around them. "Everything," she said when they parted. "Everything," he agreed. They sat a while longer, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her, while the light went off the mesas in the colors that New Mexico alone could produce, the colors that made you feel something was about to happen, and something always was, because that was the nature of a life well chosen. It kept arriving at the next thing, full of itself, full of the particular promise of people who have made something real out of the raw material of a hard country and an unexpected love. The creek ran on through the evening and would run on through the night, and into the morning when Jacob would be up before the sun to start the work, and Harriet would follow, and Will would ride out with him, and Albert would try to follow and be sent back for breakfast, and Lily would be at the table with her examinations materials before anyone else was fully awake. The days would be full and hard and good, as they had been and would continue to be, the way good days are, not perfect, not easy, but full of the people who matter. Hatter's Run ran on. The territory breathed around them. And Jacob Fairchild, who had been the man the territory used to frighten children, sat on the bank of a creek with his wife's head on his shoulder and the last light on the water, and was home.